The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Sarah Martinez adjusted her civilian clothes one last time before walking through the gates. At 28, she looked younger than her years, standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall with a slight build that made her appear almost fragile. The guards at the entrance barely glanced at her identification before waving her through, assuming she was probably someone's wife or perhaps a clerk reporting for administrative duties. Sarah had been hired as the new combat training specialist, but nobody at Fort Richardson seemed to know exactly what that meant. The personnel office had simply told various department heads that a civilian contractor would be joining them to assist with training protocols. The vague description had already sparked countless conversations in the mess halls and barracks about what kind of desk job the military was outsourcing now. Colonel James Harrison was reviewing morning reports when his aide knocked on the door. "Sir, the new civilian specialist is here to see you." "Send them in," Harrison replied without looking up from his paperwork. He expected to see a middle-aged man in a cheap suit, probably some former military bureaucrat looking to make easy money consulting on things he had learned from textbooks. When Sarah walked in, Harrison's pen stopped moving. He looked up, then around the room, then back at her. "I'm sorry, I think there's been some confusion. I'm waiting for someone from the training department." "Colonel Harrison, I'm Sarah Martinez, your new combat training specialist." Sarah's voice was steady and professional, though she had delivered this same introduction dozens of times at different bases over the past 5 years. Harrison set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "Ma'am, I think there's been some kind of administrative error. We were expecting someone to help design combat training programs for our special operations candidates. These are elite soldiers who need the most advanced tactical instruction available." "I understand completely, sir. I'm here to provide exactly that." Sarah reached into her folder and pulled out a thin file. "I have my credentials and references from my previous assignments." The colonel glanced at the papers with barely concealed skepticism. The file seemed surprisingly thin for someone claiming expertise in special operations training. "Miss Martinez, with all due respect, combat training for elite military units is extremely complex. It requires someone who understands the physical and mental demands these soldiers face. Someone who has actually been in combat situations." "I understand your concerns, Colonel. Perhaps we could discuss the specifics of what you're looking for in the training program?" Harrison sighed and stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the training grounds. Below, he could see groups of soldiers running obstacle courses and conducting tactical exercises. These men have been training for months to qualify for some of the most dangerous missions our military conducts. They need instruction from someone who can push them beyond their limits, someone who understands what real combat looks like. "What specific areas do you feel need the most attention?" Sarah asked, pulling out a notepad. "Physical conditioning, tactical awareness, weapons proficiency, survival skills, psychological resilience." Harrison turned back to face her. "Look, I'm sure you're very qualified for whatever it is you normally do, but this isn't a classroom situation. This is about preparing warriors for life and death situations." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Would it be possible for me to observe some of the current training sessions? It would help me understand exactly what the soldiers are working on." "I suppose that would be fine," Harrison agreed, though his tone suggested he thought it would be a waste of time. "Sergeant Williams can show you around. But, I should warn you, it can get pretty intense out there. These aren't regular Army recruits." 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself following Sergeant First Class Mike Williams across the sprawling training complex. Williams was a 20-year veteran with arms like tree trunks and a permanent scowl that suggested he had seen everything the military could throw at him. "So you're the new trainer?" Williams asked as they walked toward a group of soldiers practicing hand-to-hand combat. "No offense, but you don't exactly look like someone who spends time in the field." "I can understand why you might think that," Sarah replied, watching as two large soldiers grappled with each other under the supervision of an instructor. "It's not personal," Williams continued. "It's just that these guys are preparing for missions where one mistake can get their entire team killed. They need trainers who have been there, who know what it's like when everything goes wrong." They stopped at the edge of a training area where 12 soldiers were practicing close-quarters combat techniques. Sarah watched silently as the instructor demonstrated various holds and strikes, noting the techniques being taught and how the soldiers responded to instruction. "That's Corporal Jackson," Williams pointed to a particularly large soldier who seemed to be dominating every sparring match. "Former college wrestler, been training in mixed martial arts for 6 years. Most of these guys have similar backgrounds. They're not exactly beginners." Sarah continued watching, occasionally asking questions about specific techniques or training protocols. Williams found himself surprised by the sophistication of her questions. She seemed to understand the tactical applications of what they were learning, not just the physical movements. "How often do they train in low-light conditions?" she asked. "Twice a week, usually night exercises in the woods behind the base." "What about training with limited mobility? Situations where they might be injured or operating in confined spaces?" Williams paused. "We do some of that, but it's mostly theoretical. Hard to simulate those conditions safely." After an hour of observation, Williams led Sarah to the mess hall for lunch. Word had already spread that there was a new civilian on base, and Sarah could feel curious eyes following her as she got her food and sat down at a table with Williams and several other instructors. "So what do you think of our operation?" asked Master Sergeant Tony Rodriguez, a lean man with graying hair and intelligent eyes. "It's impressive," Sarah replied honestly. "The soldiers are clearly dedicated and the instruction is solid. I can see why Fort Richardson has such a strong reputation." "But?" Rodriguez sensed there was more she wasn't saying. "Well, I noticed that most of the training focuses on ideal conditions. Clear visibility, level ground, full mobility, adequate equipment." Sarah took a sip of her coffee. "Real combat situations are rarely that accommodating." The table fell quiet. Several of the instructors exchanged glances that suggested they weren't sure whether to be offended or curious about where this was heading. "Combat is unpredictable," continued Corporal David Kim, who had been listening from the next table. "That's why we train them to be adaptable." "Absolutely," Sarah agreed. "But adaptability comes from experiencing unpredictable situations during training, not just talking about them." "You sound like you have some specific ideas," Rodriguez said carefully. "I might have a few suggestions, but I'd want to understand more about the specific missions these soldiers will be facing." Williams leaned forward. "Most of that information is classified, but I can tell you they need to be ready for anything. Urban environments, wilderness survival, hostage rescue, reconnaissance behind enemy lines. These aren't peacekeeping missions." Sarah nodded. "In that case, the training should probably include more scenarios where things go wrong. Where their equipment fails, where they're outnumbered, where they have to improvise with limited resources." "Easier said than done," Kim replied. "How do you safely train someone for situations where they're supposed to be overwhelmed and under-equipped?" "There are ways," Sarah said quietly. "It requires different thinking about what constitutes realistic training." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base's executive officer. Hayes was known for her no-nonsense approach and her skepticism of anything that hadn't been proven through years of military tradition. "I hear we have a new expert on combat training," Hayes said, taking a seat at the table without invitation. "Tell me, Miss Martinez, what's your military background?" "I don't have traditional military experience, ma'am." "I see. Police work? Private security?" "Not exactly." Hayes leaned back in her chair, a thin smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Well then, I'm curious to hear what qualifications you do have for training our elite soldiers." Sarah could feel the attention of everyone in the mess hall focusing on their table. This was clearly a test, and she suspected that her answer would determine whether she would be taken seriously or dismissed as another civilian who didn't understand military realities. "I have extensive experience in survival situations and tactical problem-solving under extreme stress," she said carefully. "That's quite vague," Hayes replied. "These soldiers need concrete skills, not theoretical knowledge. They need to know they can trust their instructor to teach them things that will keep them alive."
I completely understand that concern. Do you?
Hayes stood up, her voice carrying across the mess hall. Because from where I sit, it looks like someone in Washington decided to send us a consultant who has never been shot at, never had to make life or death decisions under fire, and probably learned everything she knows from books and movies. The mess hall had gone completely quiet. Sarah could feel dozens of eyes watching to see how she would respond to this very public challenge. She knew that her reaction in this moment would likely determine whether she had any chance of succeeding at Fort Richardson. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, you're absolutely right that trust is essential between instructor and student. These soldiers deserve to know that their training will prepare them for real-world situations. Sarah stood up as well, her voice calm but carrying clearly across the silent room. I'd be happy to demonstrate my qualifications in whatever way you think would be most appropriate. Hayes smiled more broadly now, sensing an opportunity to definitively settle the question of whether this civilian belonged on their base. Well, since you're here to train our combat specialists, perhaps you'd be interested in a small demonstration. Nothing too serious, just a chance to show these soldiers what you can teach them. What did you have in mind? Simple hand-to-hand combat exercise. You can choose any of our trainees as a sparring partner. Show us some of these survival skills you mentioned. Sarah looked around the mess hall at the faces watching her. She could see skepticism, amusement, and, in a few cases, what looked like pity for the small civilian who had just been maneuvered into an impossible situation. That sounds reasonable, she said quietly. When would be convenient? How about right now? Hayes gestured toward the door. We can use the outdoor training area. Give everyone a chance to see what our new expert can do. As the crowd began filing out of the mess hall, Sergeant Williams fell into step beside Sarah. Look, you don't have to do this, he said quietly. Hayes is trying to embarrass you. Nobody expects a civilian consultant to be able to handle our combat trainees in a physical confrontation. I appreciate the concern, Sarah replied. But, she's not wrong. If I'm going to train these soldiers, they need to know I understand what I'm talking about. Understanding and doing are two different things. Some of these guys are seriously dangerous in hand-to-hand combat. Sarah stopped walking and looked at Williams directly. Sergeant, can I ask you something? What's the most important quality for a combat instructor to have? Williams thought for a moment. Experience, I guess. Knowing what real combat is like. Not knowledge of techniques? Not physical ability? Those matter, but if you haven't been in a real fight where your life was on the line, how can you teach someone else to survive one? Sarah nodded slowly. You're absolutely right. Experience is what matters most. They had reached the outdoor training area, where a crowd of soldiers and instructors had gathered in a rough circle. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes stood in the center, clearly enjoying her role as master of ceremonies. All right everyone, gather around, Hayes called out. Our new training specialist has agreed to give us a demonstration of her capabilities. Corporal Jackson, you're our biggest and most experienced fighter. How about you show Miss Martinez some of what these soldiers will need to learn? Jackson stepped forward reluctantly. At 6 feet 3 inches and 240 pounds of muscle, he looked like he could bench press a small car. His face showed genuine concern about what he was being asked to do. Ma'am, I don't really feel comfortable with this, he said to Hayes. I mean no disrespect to Miss Martinez, but this seems like it could go badly. Don't worry, Corporal. I'm sure our expert here knows her limitations. This is just a friendly demonstration. Sarah walked to the center of the circle, looking very small next to Jackson's imposing figure. The crowd had grown to include nearly 50 soldiers and instructors, all waiting to see how this unexpected confrontation would play out. Corporal Jackson, I want you to know that I don't take this lightly, Sarah said. If we're going to do this, I need you to treat it like a real training exercise. Don't hold back because of my size or because I'm a civilian. Jackson looked uncomfortable. Miss Martinez, I really don't think this is a good idea. Neither do I, called out someone from the crowd, which drew scattered laughter. Hayes stepped forward. The rules are simple. Basic grappling, no strikes to the face, stop when someone taps out or I call it. This isn't about winning or losing, just about demonstrating skill and technique. Sarah looked around the circle one more time, then, back at Jackson. Are you ready, Corporal? Jackson sighed and moved into a fighting stance.
Yes, ma'am.
Just please be careful. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes raised her hand.
Begin.
What happened next would be discussed in the barracks and mess halls of Fort Richardson for months to come. Jackson moved forward cautiously, clearly trying to figure out how to engage without hurting the much smaller woman. Sarah waited until he was within arm's reach, then moved with a speed and precision that caught everyone completely off guard. In less than 3 seconds, Jackson was on the ground with Sarah controlling his arm in a joint lock that had him tapping out immediately. The crowd stood in stunned silence as she released him and helped him back to his feet. What the hell was that? Someone whispered from the crowd. Jackson stood up, flexing his arm and looking at Sarah with newfound respect.
Ma'am, I've never seen anything like that. How did you do that so fast? Before Sarah could answer, another voice called out from the crowd. Lucky shot. Try it again.
Hayes looked around the circle, clearly not expecting this outcome.
Well, that was interesting. Perhaps we could see another demonstration?
I'll go, volunteered Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, a compact woman with a background in military police and a reputation for being nearly impossible to take down in hand-to-hand combat.
Let's see if that was just luck.
The second match lasted slightly longer, but ended the same way, with Santos tapping out from a submission hold she couldn't even identify. Then, another soldier volunteered, and another, each confident they could solve the puzzle of how such a small civilian was defeating their best fighters. After the 7th consecutive victory, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes called a halt to the demonstrations. The crowd began dispersing, but the conversations were intense and animated. Sarah could hear fragments of discussion as soldiers tried to understand what they had just witnessed.
Did you see how she moved?
It was like she knew what he was going to do before he did it.
I'd been training martial arts for 15 years. I've never seen techniques like that. Where the hell did they find this woman?
As Sarah collected her things and prepared to leave the training area, she found herself surrounded by a small group of the soldiers she had just defeated. Far from being angry or embarrassed, they looked curious and excited. Miss Martinez, Corporal Jackson said, I know this might sound weird after what just happened, but I really want to learn how to do what you just did.
Could you teach us some of those techniques?
Yeah, added Santos. I thought I knew how to fight, but you just showed me I don't know anything. Sarah looked at the faces around her, seeing genuine interest where there had been skepticism just an hour earlier. Those techniques are definitely something we can work on. But they're just tools. The real training is about learning to think differently under pressure. What do you mean? Asked another soldier. Most people fight the way they train, using the techniques they've practiced under controlled conditions. But real combat isn't controlled. You have to be able to adapt when nothing goes according to plan. Colonel Harrison appeared at the edge of the group, having witnessed the entire demonstration from a distance.
Miss Martinez, could I speak with you privately for a moment? As they walked away from the crowd, Harrison shook his head in amazement. I owe you an apology.
I made assumptions based on appearances, and I was completely wrong. You weren't wrong to be concerned about qualifications, Colonel. These soldiers deserve the best training available.
Where did you learn to fight like that? That wasn't just martial arts training. Sarah paused before answering. It's complicated, sir. Let's just say I've had some unusual experiences that taught me things you can't learn in a traditional training environment.
Harrison studied her face, sensing there was much more to the story.
Well, whatever your background is, I think we can all agree that you've proven your point. When can you start working with our trainees? How about tomorrow morning?
I'd like to begin with some basic scenarios and see how they respond to unexpected situations.
Sounds good.
I'll let Sergeant Williams know to have the training area ready.
Harrison paused. One more thing.
Lieutenant Colonel Hayes asked me to tell you she'd like to speak with you privately when you have a chance.
Sarah nodded, knowing that conversation would be interesting.
Hayes had clearly expected the demonstration to end very differently, and she would probably want to understand exactly what had just happened.
As Sarah walked back toward the main building, she reflected on how the day had unfolded.
She had faced this same pattern at every new assignment over the past 5 years. Initial skepticism based on her appearance, followed by demands to prove herself, followed by amazement when she demonstrated capabilities that seemed impossible for someone with her background. The truth was that Sarah Martinez had learned her combat skills in the most unforgiving classroom imaginable. But that was a story she rarely told, and never completely. It was easier to let people draw their own conclusions than to explain how a quiet graduate student had ended up spending 3 years as a prisoner of war in a remote jungle, learning survival and fighting techniques from captors who valued practical skills over theoretical knowledge. Tomorrow, she would begin teaching these elite soldiers lessons learned in places where the only rule was survival, and where every day brought new challenges that couldn't be solved with standard military doctrine. But tonight, she would prepare training scenarios based on experiences she hoped these young warriors would never have to face in reality. The sun was setting over Fort Richardson as Sarah made her way to her temporary quarters, already planning the lessons that would transform these confident soldiers into something far more dangerous and far more adaptable than they had ever imagined possible. The next morning arrived with an unseasonably cold wind that cut across the training grounds like a knife. Sarah stood at the edge of the obstacle course at 5:30 in the morning, watching the first group of 12 soldiers arrive for what they assumed would be a standard training session. Most of them looked curious but confident, still riding the high of yesterday's unexpected demonstration. Sergeant Williams approached with a steaming cup of coffee and a clipboard full of training schedules.
"Morning, Sarah. I have to admit, I'm curious to see what you have planned. These guys have been talking about yesterday all night."
"Good," Sarah replied, adjusting the equipment she had requested from the base supply office.
Curiosity is a useful starting point. It means they're ready to learn something new.
The soldiers formed up in their usual formation, but Sarah gestured for them to gather around her in a loose circle instead.
"Today we're going to do something different. I want you to forget everything you think you know about combat training."
Corporal Jackson, who had become something of an unofficial spokesman for the group, raised his hand.
"Ma'am, are we going to learn more of those techniques you used yesterday?" "Eventually.
But first, we need to talk about assumptions." Sarah pulled out a small notebook and began reading from it. "Yesterday, everyone made assumptions about what I could or couldn't do based on my appearance.
You assumed I would be easy to defeat because I'm small and I'm not military."
You were wrong, but you're not the first people to make that mistake." She closed the notebook and looked around the circle.
"Now I want you to think about assumptions you make when you're preparing for a mission. What do you assume about your equipment, your intelligence, your backup support, your enemies?"
The soldiers exchanged glances, not sure where this was leading. They were used to training that focused on physical skills and tactical procedures, not philosophical discussions about assumptions.
"Ma'am," said Sergeant Santos, "we're trained to plan for contingencies. We know things can go wrong." "Really? Let's test that."
Sarah picked up a radio from her equipment pile and handed it to Santos. "Your mission is to get from here to the mess hall and back.
You have 30 minutes.
This radio is your lifeline to base support.
Go."
Santos looked confused but took the radio and began jogging toward the mess hall, about half a mile away. The other soldiers watched as she disappeared around a building. While we're waiting, Sarah said to the remaining soldiers, "I want you to think about what could go wrong with that simple mission." "The radio could malfunction," suggested Private First Class Thompson. "She could get injured," added another soldier. "Someone could be waiting to ambush her," said Jackson.
Good answers. Now, how many of you have trained for missions where your communication equipment fails completely? A few hands went up hesitantly. How many have trained for missions where your intelligence is completely wrong? Fewer hands remained raised. How many have trained for missions where you're abandoned by your support team and have to complete the objective anyway?
Only one hand stayed up, belonging to a quiet soldier named Rodriguez who had seen combat in Afghanistan. 15 minutes later, Santos came jogging back, slightly winded but clearly confident. She held up the radio triumphantly.
"Mission accomplished, ma'am. No problems." "Excellent."
"Now, Rodriguez, I need you to tell Santos that her radio has been compromised and the enemy knows her exact location. Santos, you have 5 minutes to get back to the mess hall, retrieve a message from the cook, and return here without being detected.
Rodriguez and Thompson will be hunting for you." Santos's confident expression faltered. "Ma'am, that's a completely different mission."
"Yes, it is.
Welcome to real combat operations." Sarah looked at her watch. "Clock starts now."
What followed was a chaotic game of cat and mouse that bore no resemblance to the structured exercises these soldiers were accustomed to.
Santos had to think on her feet, using buildings and terrain for concealment while completing an objective she hadn't planned for.
Meanwhile, Rodriguez and Thompson discovered that hunting for someone in familiar territory was much harder than they expected. When the exercise ended, all 3 soldiers were breathing hard and looking frustrated. "That was impossible," Santos complained.
"How was I supposed to plan for a mission that kept changing?"
"You weren't supposed to plan for it," Sarah replied. "You were supposed to adapt to it. In real combat, your mission parameters can change completely while you're in the field.
Your equipment can fail. Your intelligence can be wrong. Your support can disappear. The question is, can you still accomplish something useful?"
She gestured for the group to sit down on the ground around her.
"Traditional military training is excellent for teaching you to execute complex plans under ideal conditions.
But it can create a dangerous dependency on those ideal conditions.
What happens when your GPS fails? When your night vision breaks? When your backup team gets pinned down and can't reach you?" "We improvise," said Jackson, though his voice lacked conviction. "Do you? Or do you panic because nothing is working the way it's supposed to?" Sarah pulled out several pieces of equipment from her bag. "Thompson, catch."
She threw him what looked like a standard military radio, but when he tried to use it, nothing happened.
"Santos, here's your GPS unit."
She handed over a device that showed only static.
"Jackson, here's your night vision scope."
The device was completely non-functional. "Now," Sarah continued, "your mission is to locate a target somewhere on this base and report back with specific information about what you find.
You have 1 hour. Your equipment doesn't work.
You can't use your cell phones.
You can't ask for help from anyone not in this group. Go."
The soldiers stared at her in disbelief.
"Ma'am, that's impossible without working equipment." "Is it? How did soldiers complete missions before GPS and radio communication were invented? How do people navigate when their technology fails? How do you gather intelligence when your surveillance equipment breaks down?"
"We use maps and compasses," suggested Thompson.
"Do you have maps and compasses?" "Well, no, but we could get them." "What if you can't? What if you're dropped into a situation where you have nothing but what's in your pockets?"
Sarah stood up and pointed toward the base.
"There are a dozen ways to navigate without GPS. There are multiple ways to communicate without radios. There are countless methods of gathering intelligence without electronic surveillance. The question is, do you know any of them?"
The challenge took the soldiers 2.5 hours to complete, and they only succeeded after learning to work together in ways their normal training had never required. They had to read the sun's position for direction, observe patrol patterns to avoid detection, and use hand signals and predetermined meeting points to coordinate their movements. When they finally returned, exhausted and frustrated but successful, Sarah could see something had changed in their expressions.
"How do you feel?" she asked. "Exhausted," said Santos. "Confused," added Thompson. "But, also."
Jackson paused, searching for the right word.
"Accomplished?"
"Like we figured out something important."
"You did.
You discovered that you're more capable than you thought, and
that your real limitations aren't your equipment or your training protocols. Your real limitations are your assumptions about what's possible. Sarah spent the next hour debriefing the exercise, helping the soldiers understand what they had learned about navigation, communication, and problem-solving under stress. But, more importantly, she helped them recognize how their thinking had changed when they were forced to abandon their usual tools and methods. Tomorrow, she announced as the session ended, we're going to work on combat techniques. But, not the kind you're expecting. That afternoon, word of the morning's unusual training session spread throughout Fort Richardson like wildfire. By dinner time, Sarah found herself fielding questions from instructors and administrators who wanted to understand what she was teaching. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes approached her in the mess hall with an expression that mixed curiosity with professional skepticism. I hear you had the men running around the base without working equipment. Some people are saying it was either brilliant or completely insane. Which do you think it was? Sarah asked, continuing to eat her meal. I think it was unauthorized and, potentially dangerous. Those soldiers could have been injured or gotten into trouble without proper communication equipment. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. You're absolutely right. It was dangerous. Combat is dangerous. The question is whether we want to prepare them for dangerous situations or protect them from dangerous situations. There's a difference between realistic training and reckless training. I agree completely. Can you help me understand where you think the line is? Hayes sat down across from Sarah, clearly intending to have a serious conversation about training protocols and safety procedures. But, before she could begin, they were interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Harrison, who was accompanied by a man in civilian clothes that Sarah didn't recognize. Sarah, I'd like you to meet Dr. William Foster from the Pentagon's Advanced Training Research Division, Harrison said. He flew in this afternoon specifically to observe your methods. Dr. Foster was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful demeanor of someone who spent most of his time analyzing data rather than working in the field. He shook Sarah's hand with obvious curiosity. Miss Martinez, I've been hearing some very interesting reports about your training techniques. I understand you're taking a rather unconventional approach with our special operations candidates. I'm trying to help them think differently about problem-solving under stress, Sarah replied carefully. Yes, I've heard about today's navigation exercise. Very creative. I'm particularly interested in your theories about equipment dependency and adaptive thinking. Foster pulled out a small recording device. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions about your methodology? Sarah glanced at Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who was watching this exchange with obvious interest. I'd be happy to discuss my approach, but I'm not sure how much theoretical analysis would be useful. The training is really about practical experience. Of course. But I'm curious about the underlying principles. How do you determine which assumptions to challenge? How do you measure whether soldiers are developing genuine adaptability versus just learning new procedures? The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour, with Foster asking increasingly sophisticated questions about training psychology and stress response. Sarah found herself impressed by his understanding of the theoretical frameworks behind her methods, even as she sensed he had never experienced the kind of real-world application she was drawing from. One thing I'm curious about, Foster said eventually, is your background. Your approach suggests extensive field experience, but I understand you don't have traditional military training. Where did you develop these insights? Sarah had been expecting this question, and she had prepared a careful answer. I spent several years in situations where standard procedures weren't available and equipment couldn't be relied upon. I learned that people are capable of much more than they realize when they're forced to think creatively. Civilian consulting work? Foster pressed. Something like that. Hayes leaned forward. Dr. Foster, I think we should discuss some of the safety and protocol concerns raised by today's training. Actually, Foster replied, I'm more interested in the results. Colonel Harrison, have you noticed any changes in the soldiers' performance or attitude? Harrison nodded slowly. It's only been 2 days, but there's definitely something different about their confidence level. They seem more curious about problem solving,
less dependent on standard procedures.
That's exactly what we're hoping to see, Foster said, making notes on his tablet. Miss Martinez, I'd like to observe tomorrow's session if that's possible.
And I'd also like to discuss the possibility of expanding your program to other bases.
Sarah felt a familiar mix of excitement and apprehension.
She had been through this process before at other military installations, and she knew that success brought its own complications. The more attention her training methods received, the more questions people asked about her background and qualifications. "I'd be happy to have you observe," she said. "But I should warn you that tomorrow's session might be even more unconventional than today's."
"How so?" Hayes asked with obvious concern.
"We're going to work on combat techniques, but the focus will be on fighting when everything goes wrong. When you're injured, when your weapons malfunction, when you're outnumbered and outgunned."
Foster's eyes lit up with interest. Survival combat? That's fascinating.
Most military training assumes relatively equal odds and functional equipment.
Most military training is excellent for most situations, Sarah agreed.
But I'm trying to prepare these soldiers for the situations that standard training doesn't cover. The next morning arrived with a heavy fog that reduced visibility to less than 50 yards. Sarah had requested the outdoor training area be cleared of all standard equipment, leaving only a few basic props scattered around the space. 12 soldiers arrived precisely on time, but their confident demeanor from the previous day had been replaced by nervous curiosity. Word had spread about Dr. Foster's presence, and everyone knew they were being evaluated by someone from the Pentagon.
"Today we're going to learn about fighting when everything goes wrong," Sarah announced without preamble. "Jackson, I need you to pretend your dominant arm is completely useless.
Santos, you're going to operate as if you can't see clearly.
Thompson, you're dealing with a leg injury that prevents you from running."
The soldiers looked at each other uncertainly. This was not what they had expected from combat training.
"Ma'am," Jackson said, "how are we supposed to fight effectively with simulated injuries?" "That's exactly the point.
In real combat, you don't get to choose when you're injured or how serious the injuries are. You have to be able to continue fighting and complete your mission regardless of your physical condition." Sarah demonstrated a series of techniques designed for fighting with limited mobility, reduced vision, and non-functional limbs. But, more importantly, she showed them how to think about combat differently when they couldn't rely on their usual advantages. "Most of your training teaches you to fight from a position of strength," she explained while showing Santos how to use sound and movement to compensate for limited vision.
"You assume you'll have working equipment, full mobility, and adequate backup. But what if you don't? What if your strength becomes your weakness?"
She paired each soldier with a partner and assigned them specific limitations, then had them work through various scenarios where they had to protect each other while dealing with their simulated handicaps. Dr. Foster watched from the sidelines, occasionally making notes but mostly observing how the soldiers adapted to the unusual challenges.
After an hour of exercises, he approached Sarah with obvious excitement.
"This is remarkable," he said quietly. "I've never seen training that forces soldiers to think this creatively about tactical problem solving. Where did you get the idea for this approach?" Sarah paused her instruction and looked at Foster directly.
"Dr. Foster, have you ever been in a situation where your survival depended on your ability to fight when everything was working against you?" "Well, no. My experience is primarily theoretical." "Then, let me ask you this, would you like to understand this training from the inside? Would you be willing to participate in one of the exercises?"
Foster looked uncertain but intrigued. "I suppose that would give me valuable insight into the psychological aspects of the training."
"Excellent. Thompson, I need you to work with Dr. Foster.
Foster, you're going to learn what it feels like to defend yourself when you can't rely on physical strength or standard techniques."
What followed was an enlightening experience for the Pentagon researcher.
Within minutes, he discovered that his theoretical understanding of combat stress was vastly different from the reality of trying to think clearly while under physical pressure. "I can't think," he gasped after a particularly intense exercise.
"My mind just goes blank." "Exactly," Sarah replied. "That's why this type of training is so important. You have to learn to think differently when your usual mental processes aren't available. By the end of the 2-hour session, both Dr. Foster and the soldiers had experienced something fundamentally different from traditional combat training. They had learned to fight not just with their bodies, but with their minds, adapting to constantly changing circumstances and finding solutions when conventional methods failed. "I need to make some phone calls," Foster announced as the training session ended. "This program needs to be expanded immediately." Colonel Harrison approached Sarah as the soldiers began heading back to their barracks. "I'm starting to understand what you're really teaching them. It's not just combat techniques, is it?" "No, sir. It's a different way of thinking about problems."
In combat, in life, in any situation where the stakes are high and the resources are limited.
"Where did you learn to think like this, Sarah?"
"I mean really learn it, not just study it." Sarah looked across the training ground, where the last few soldiers were still practicing the techniques they had learned, helping each other work through the challenges of fighting with simulated injuries and limitations. "Colonel, some lessons can only be learned in places where there are no safety nets and no backup plans. Where the only choice is to adapt or fail completely." She turned back to meet his eyes. "I learned these lessons somewhere most people never have to go. But I learned them well enough to make sure these soldiers never have to learn them the hard way." That evening, as Sarah prepared her notes for the next day's training, she received a message that Dr. Foster wanted to meet with her privately. She found him in Colonel Harrison's office, surrounded by papers and talking rapidly into a secure telephone. When he finished his call, Foster looked at Sarah with an expression of intense curiosity mixed with professional admiration. "I've just spent 3 hours explaining your training methods to some very important people in Washington," he said. "They want to know everything about your background, your techniques, and your availability for expanded assignments." "What did you tell them?" "I told them that you're either the most innovative combat instructor I've ever observed, or you're someone with field experience that goes far beyond anything in your official file." Foster paused, studying her face carefully. "I also told them that I think your methods could revolutionize how we prepare soldiers for the realities of modern combat." Sarah remained silent, waiting to see where this conversation was heading. "The question," Foster continued, "is whether you're prepared for the level of scrutiny that comes with that kind of recognition. Because if we implement your training program across multiple bases, people are going to want to know exactly how you develop these capabilities. And what if I'm not ready for that level of scrutiny? Then, we have a problem, because what you're teaching is too valuable to keep limited to one base with 12 soldiers." Foster leaned forward. "Sarah, I need to ask you directly, is there anything in your background that would prevent you from working with classified military programs?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. She had been through similar conversations before, and she knew that her response would determine whether she could continue her work or whether she would have to disappear again and start over somewhere else. "Dr. Foster, my background is complicated. But my loyalty to these soldiers and their mission is absolute. Everything I do is focused on giving them the best possible chance of survival and success." "That's not really an answer." "It's the only answer I can give you right now." Foster studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I think I understand. And I think that's going to have to be enough for now." As Sarah walked back to her quarters that night, she knew that her time at Fort Richardson was about to become much more complicated. Success always brought attention, and attention always led to questions she couldn't fully answer. But, for now, she had 12 soldiers who were learning to think differently about survival and adaptation, and that was worth whatever complications lay ahead. 2 weeks later, Fort Richardson had transformed into something resembling a small research facility. Dr. Foster had returned with a team of military psychologists, training specialists, and Pentagon observers, all eager to document and analyze Sarah's methods. The 12 original soldiers had become something of a test group, with their progress being measured and recorded by experts who flew in from Washington every few days. Sarah stood in the briefing room at 6 in the morning, looking at a whiteboard covered with performance metrics, psychological assessment scores, and training timelines that she had never asked for and didn't particularly want. Her simple approach to teaching adaptive thinking had somehow become the subject of multiple research studies and policy discussions. The preliminary results are extraordinary, Dr. Foster was explaining to a room full of senior officers and Pentagon officials. Combat effectiveness scores have improved by 37%. Problem solving under stress has increased by 52%. Most importantly, confidence in unknown situations has improved by over 60%. Colonel Harrison raised his hand.
Those are impressive numbers, but what do they mean in practical terms?
It means, Foster continued, that soldiers trained in Martinez's methods are significantly more likely to complete missions when standard procedures fail.
They adapt faster, think more creatively, and maintain effectiveness under conditions that would paralyze traditionally trained personnel. Sarah watched this presentation with mixed feelings.
She was proud of what her students had accomplished, but frustrated by the way their progress was being reduced to statistics and data points. The real value of their training couldn't be measured on a spreadsheet. Dr. Foster, interrupted General Patricia Walsh, a stern woman who had flown in from the Pentagon the previous day, I'm more interested in scalability.
Can these methods be taught to instructors who can then train larger groups of soldiers?
That's the key question, Foster replied.
Miss Martinez, would you care to address the General's concerns?
Sarah stepped forward, acutely aware that her answer would determine the future of everything she had been working toward.
General Walsh, the methods can certainly be taught.
But they require instructors who understand the difference between simulating stress and creating genuine adaptive challenges.
Explain that distinction.
Most military training creates controlled stress designed to test specific skills. What I do is create unpredictable situations that force students to develop new skills on the spot.
The difference is that my approach doesn't have predetermined solutions. General Walsh frowned.
That sounds like a recipe for chaos. Military training requires structure and measurable outcomes.
With respect, General, chaos is exactly what soldiers face in real combat operations. The question is whether we prepare them for chaos or protect them from it during training. The room fell silent as the senior officers absorbed this perspective. Sarah could see some nodding in agreement while others looked skeptical.
Miss Martinez, said Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who had been quietly observing from the back of the room, I think the General's concern is about quality control.
How do we ensure that different instructors are teaching these methods correctly?
That's a valid concern, Sarah acknowledged.
But I think you're asking the wrong question.
Instead of asking how to standardize the training, maybe you should ask how to select instructors who can handle non-standardized training.
What do you mean? General Walsh asked. I mean that not every good combat instructor can teach adaptive thinking.
It requires people who are comfortable with uncertainty, who can think on their feet, and who understand that sometimes the best lesson plan is no lesson plan at all.
Dr. Foster pulled up a new slide on the projector.
We've actually been analyzing the characteristics of effective instructors for this type of training. The profiles are quite interesting. The slide showed a list of traits that seem to have little correlation with traditional military instruction experience. Comfort with ambiguity, creative problem-solving ability, field experience in unpredictable environments, and psychological resilience under stress. In other words, Sarah said quietly, you need instructors who have learned these lessons the same way I did.
Through experience that can't be simulated.
General Walsh studied the slide thoughtfully.
Miss Martinez, I'm going to ask you the same question Dr. Foster asked 2 weeks ago. Where exactly did you gain this experience?
Sarah had been dreading this moment, but she had also been preparing for it. She knew that her answer would either open new opportunities or end her military training career permanently. General, I spent 3 years in captivity in Southeast Asia, held by insurgents who had no interest in following Geneva Convention guidelines for prisoner treatment. Sarah's voice remained steady, but everyone in the room could hear the weight behind her words. I learned adaptive combat techniques because my survival depended on it. I learned to fight when injured because I was frequently injured. I learned to think creatively under stress because creativity was the only thing standing between me and death.
The room erupted in whispered conversations as the officers processed this revelation.
General Walsh raised her hand for silence.
You're saying you were a prisoner of war? Why isn't this in your file? Because I wasn't military personnel when I was captured. I was a graduate student doing research on agricultural development. Technically, I was a civilian hostage, not a POW. How did a graduate student end up in that situation? Colonel Harrison asked gently.
Wrong place, wrong time, bad intelligence about the security situation in the region. Sarah looked around the room at the faces staring at her. But what I learned during those 3 years is directly relevant to what these soldiers need to know. Dr. Foster leaned forward.
Sarah, this explains everything about your methods.
You're not teaching theory, you're teaching survival skills you actually used.
More than that, Sarah replied. I'm teaching the psychological adaptation that kept me functional when nothing was working the way it was supposed to.
When my captors decided I might be more useful as a training partner than as a prisoner, I learned combat techniques that had nothing to do with rules or fair play. General Walsh stood up and walked to the front of the room.
Miss Martinez, this information changes everything about how we evaluate your program.
If you're teaching lessons learned during actual captivity, we need to understand exactly what you're passing on to our soldiers.
I'm teaching them to survive when survival seems impossible.
I'm teaching them to fight when fighting seems pointless. Most importantly, I'm teaching them to think when thinking is the only weapon they have left. The briefing continued for another hour, with Sarah answering increasingly detailed questions about her captivity, her escape, and the specific techniques she had learned. By the time the session ended, the Pentagon officials had a much clearer understanding of why her methods were so effective, but also a much more complex set of decisions to make about implementation. That afternoon, Sarah found herself alone with the 12 soldiers she had been training, finally, free from the observers and analysts who had been documenting their every move. "Ma'am," Corporal Jackson said, "we heard about what you told them this morning."
About what happened to you? How do you feel about that? Sarah asked. Honestly? It makes everything make sense, said Santos.
The way you teach us to handle equipment failures, to fight when we're hurt, to think when we're scared.
You weren't making it up. No, I wasn't making it up.
Thompson spoke up quietly.
Ma'am, were you really held prisoner for 3 years? Yes. And you escaped? Eventually. How?
Sarah considered her answer carefully. These soldiers had earned the right to understand where their training was coming from, but she wasn't sure they were ready for the complete truth about what those 3 years had involved.
I escaped by applying everything I've been teaching you.
When the opportunity came, I had to move fast, think creatively, and solve problems I had never trained for. I had to fight when I was injured, navigate without equipment, and survive on resources I improvised from whatever was available. The soldiers sat in silence, absorbing the implications of what she was telling them.
The techniques we've been practicing, Rodriguez said slowly, those came from your captors? Some of them. Others I developed myself, or learned from fellow prisoners who didn't survive. Sarah met each of their eyes in turn.
But the most important thing I learned wasn't a technique at all. I learned that your mind is your most powerful weapon, and that you can survive almost anything if you refuse to give up thinking.
Is that why you wanted us to learn to fight without equipment? To navigate without GPS? Jackson asked. Partially. But also because I want you to understand that you're more capable than you realize.
When everything goes wrong, when all your advantages are stripped away, you still have your intelligence, your training, and your determination.
Those are the only weapons that never malfunction.
That evening, Sarah was summoned to another meeting with General Walsh and Dr. Foster. This time, the discussion was more personal and much more intense. "Miss Martinez," General Walsh began, "we need to discuss the security implications of your background. 3 years of captivity means 3 years of potential exposure to enemy interrogation techniques, psychological manipulation, and possible recruitment attempts."
I understand your concerns, General. Do you?
Because implementing your training program across multiple bases would give you access to classified information and contact with elite military personnel.
We need to be absolutely certain that your loyalties haven't been compromised.
Sarah had been through security investigations before, but never at this level of intensity.
General, I've been working with military personnel for 5 years since my escape. Every assignment has included security screening. Basic screening, yes. But not the level required for the expanded program we're considering. Foster pulled out a thick folder.
We're talking about detailed psychological evaluation, polygraph examinations, and extensive background investigation.
What exactly are you looking for? We need to understand what happened during those 3 years. Who held you captive, what they taught you, what they asked you, how you escaped, and whether you maintain any contact with individuals from that period.
Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever she was forced to relive those years in detail.
Some of that information might be difficult to verify. Many of the people involved are dead. We understand that.
But we need to know everything, including the parts that might be difficult to discuss. The next several hours were unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her previous security screenings. General Walsh and Dr. Foster were joined by specialists in counterintelligence and psychological assessment who asked questions that forced her to recall details she had spent years trying to forget. They wanted to know about specific individuals who had held her prisoner, techniques they had used to break down her resistance, information she might have revealed under duress, and the exact circumstances of her escape. They were particularly interested in the combat training she had received and whether it had been provided willingly or as part of a larger conditioning process. The individuals who trained me in hand-to-hand combat, Sarah explained carefully, were not ideologically motivated. They were pragmatists who valued practical skills and recognized that I might be more useful to them if I could defend myself. Useful how? The counterintelligence specialist asked. They were holding several prisoners, and they needed people who could maintain order and prevent escape attempts.
Someone with combat training could help them manage the other captives. So you became a collaborator?
Sarah felt anger rise in her throat, but she kept her voice level.
I became a survivor. I did what was necessary to stay alive and to keep other prisoners alive. When the opportunity to escape arose, I took it.
The questioning continued late into the night, covering every aspect of her captivity, her escape, and her subsequent activities. By the time it ended, Sarah felt emotionally drained and uncertain about whether she had passed whatever test she was being subjected to. 3 days later, General Walsh called her back for a final meeting.
This time, the atmosphere was less confrontational and more businesslike.
Miss Martinez, the investigation has raised some concerns, but it has also convinced us that your experience is genuinely valuable for military training purposes.
Walsh pulled out a new set of documents.
We're prepared to offer you a position as a senior training specialist with expanded responsibilities and appropriate security clearance.
Sarah looked at the papers without touching them. What kind of expanded responsibilities?
You would oversee implementation of adaptive training programs at 6 different bases. You would also be responsible for selecting and training instructors who can carry on your methods.
And the security restrictions?
Substantial, but manageable. You would be working exclusively with classified programs, which means limited contact with non-military personnel and regular security reviews. Sarah studied General Walsh's face, trying to understand what this offer really meant.
General, can I ask you something? Do you believe that what I'm teaching will actually save soldiers' lives?
I believe it will save a significant number of lives, yes.
Then, I need you to understand something.
The techniques I teach work because they come from real experience in situations where failure meant death. If you turn this into a standardized program with predictable procedures, it will lose most of its effectiveness.
What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that you can't mass-produce this kind of training.
You can identify people who have the right kind of experience and temperament to teach it, but you can't create a curriculum that transforms regular instructors into specialists in adaptive combat thinking.
Dr. Foster leaned forward. Are you saying the program can't be scaled up?
I'm saying it can be scaled up, but only if you're willing to accept that it will look different at each base and with each group of students.
The moment you try to standardize it, you destroy what makes it effective.
General Walsh considered this for several minutes.
That presents significant challenges for military implementation.
We need consistency and measurable outcomes.
Then, you need to decide what's more important, consistency or effectiveness.
Because in my experience, you can't have both when you're preparing people for genuinely unpredictable situations. The conversation ended without a clear resolution, leaving Sarah uncertain about whether she had just accepted a promotion or ended her military training career. But, as she walked back to her quarters, she knew she had been honest about the limitations of what she could offer. That night, she received an unexpected visitor. Corporal Jackson knocked on her door, looking nervous and determined.
"Ma'am, I wanted to talk to you about something. The whole unit has been discussing what's going to happen to our training program. What's the consensus? We want you to know that what you've taught us has already changed how we think about everything. Not just combat, but problem solving in general." Jackson paused, searching for the right words. "We understand that you might not be able to continue working with us, but we want you to know that we'll carry these lessons with us wherever we go."
"That means more to me than you realize, Jackson."
"Ma'am, can I ask you one more question?
When you were held prisoner, did you ever think you'd end up teaching soldiers what you learned?" Sarah smiled for the first time in days.
"No, Jackson. I thought I would spend the rest of my life trying to forget what I learned. Teaching it has been much more therapeutic than forgetting it." The next morning brought news that would change everything once again.
General Walsh had received new orders from Washington, and the entire program was being moved to a classified facility where Sarah's methods would be developed into something the Pentagon was calling advanced survival training for special operations personnel. Whether Sarah would be part of that development remained to be seen, but her 12 students at Fort Richardson had already proven that her unconventional approach to combat training could transform good soldiers into something much more dangerous and much more adaptable than anyone had previously thought possible. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of the most elite training facility the U.S. military had ever constructed. Located in the mountains of Colorado, the Advanced Combat Training Center was designed specifically to implement the methods she had developed at Fort Richardson. The facility looked more like a university campus than a military base, with multiple training environments that could simulate everything from urban warfare to jungle survival. General Walsh had kept her word about the expanded program, but the reality of implementation had proven far more complex than anyone had anticipated. Sarah now oversaw a staff of 37 instructors working with over 200 special operations candidates across 12 different training scenarios. The quiet, personal approach she had used with 12 soldiers had evolved into something resembling a military academy for unconventional warfare.
"The morning briefing starts in 10 minutes, announced Captain Lisa Chen, Sarah's newly assigned military liaison.
Chen was a West Point graduate with a background in special operations who had been specifically selected to help bridge the gap between Sarah's civilian methods and military protocols. Sarah gathered her materials and walked toward the main briefing room, where she would address the latest group of instructor candidates. These were seasoned military trainers from various branches who had volunteered for what the Pentagon was now calling adaptive training specialist positions. The briefing room contained 42 men and women, all with impressive military credentials and all looking somewhat skeptical about learning training methods from a former civilian hostage. Sarah had given this same orientation dozens of times over the past 6 months, but she never got used to the initial skepticism she faced from experienced military personnel.
"Good morning.
I'm Sarah Martinez, and I'm here to teach you how to prepare soldiers for situations that can't be prepared for." She paused, letting the apparent contradiction sink in.
"Over the next 4 weeks, you're going to learn training methods that will challenge everything you think you know about military instruction." A hand shot up immediately. "Ma'am, Sergeant Major Williams, Army Rangers. With all due respect, how do you train for situations that can't be prepared for?"
That sounds like a contradiction in terms.
"Excellent question, Sergeant Major. Let me ask you something in return. In your Ranger experience, how many missions went exactly according to plan?"
Williams smiled grimly.
"None of them."
"And yet your soldiers completed those missions successfully."
"How?"
"They adapted to changing circumstances, improvised solutions, overcame obstacles they hadn't trained for specifically."
"Exactly. So the question becomes, can we train adaptation itself, rather than training for specific situations?
Sarah moved away from the podium and began walking among the seated instructors.
Traditional military training teaches soldiers to execute complex procedures under controlled conditions.
What I teach is how to think creatively when those procedures fail. A female voice from the back called out, Major Patricia Hayes, Air Force Special Operations.
I've read the reports from Fort Richardson, and I understand your methods produced impressive results. But how do we maintain safety standards when we're deliberately creating chaotic training scenarios? Sarah paused, recognizing the name. This was Lieutenant Colonel Hayes from Fort Richardson, now promoted and assigned to evaluate her program.
Their previous interactions had been tense, and Sarah suspected that Hayes was here to identify weaknesses in the expanded training model. Major Hayes, safety is absolutely critical, but we need to distinguish between physical safety and psychological comfort. My training methods eliminate the psychological comfort of predictable scenarios while maintaining rigorous physical safety protocols.
Can you give us a specific example? Certainly.
This afternoon, you'll participate in a navigation exercise where your GPS equipment will malfunction, your maps will be deliberately inaccurate, and your compass will provide false readings. You'll still be in a controlled environment with safety personnel monitoring your location, but you'll have to solve the navigation problem using methods you haven't trained for. A murmur of interest rippled through the room. These were all experienced trainers who understood the value of realistic scenarios, but most had never considered deliberately sabotaging equipment as a training method.
The key, Sarah continued, is that you won't know which equipment is malfunctioning or how.
You'll have to test and verify everything while still completing your mission objective.
Captain Chen stood up from the back of the room. Sarah, why don't you show them the facility overview?
I think seeing the training environments will help them understand the scope of what we're attempting here.
The tour that followed was unlike anything most of the instructors had ever seen.
The facility contained urban warfare environments that could be reconfigured in real time, wilderness survival areas with controllable weather conditions, and simulation chambers that could replicate everything from aircraft emergencies to underground tunnel systems. The difference between this facility and traditional training centers, Sarah explained as they walked through a mock urban environment, is that everything here is designed to change without warning. Buildings can be reconfigured, weather can be altered, equipment can be made to malfunction remotely, and scenario objectives can be modified while training is in progress. Sergeant Major Williams stopped at a control panel that showed dozens of variables that could be adjusted during training exercises. This is incredible, but also terrifying. How do you prevent these scenarios from becoming too realistic? How do you maintain the line between training and actual danger? That's where the art of instruction comes in, Sarah replied. Each of you will learn to read stress responses in your students and adjust scenarios in real time. You'll push them to their psychological limits without crossing into actual trauma. Major Hayes examined a section of the facility designed to simulate cave and tunnel combat. This represents a massive investment in unproven training methods. What evidence do we have that this approach actually improves combat effectiveness? Captain Chen pulled out a tablet and brought up recent performance data. The soldiers trained at Fort Richardson have been deployed on 17 different missions over the past 6 months. Their success rate is 94%, compared to 78% for traditionally trained special operations units. More importantly, their casualty rate is 40% lower. Those are impressive numbers, acknowledged Hayes, but they represent a very small sample size. Which is why we're expanding the program, Sarah said. But I want to be clear about something. This isn't just about improved performance metrics. It's about giving soldiers the psychological tools they need to survive when everything goes wrong. The afternoon's practical exercise proved to be an eye-opening experience for the instructor candidates. Sarah had designed a scenario where teams of 4 had to navigate to a specific location using equipment that had been sabotaged in various ways. Some GPS units provided false coordinates, some compasses pointed to magnetic anomalies, and some maps contained subtle inaccuracies. What made the exercise particularly challenging was that the teams didn't know which equipment was unreliable, forcing them to develop verification methods and backup navigation techniques in real time. Sergeant Major Williams found himself leading a team that included Major Hayes and 2 other experienced special operations instructors. Within the first hour, they had discovered that their GPS was providing coordinates that were consistently offset by nearly a mile, but they hadn't yet realized that their compass was pointing 15 degrees off true north.
"This is incredibly frustrating," Hayes muttered as their team stopped for the 3rd time to recalculate their position. "In real operations, we would have verified our equipment before beginning the mission."
"Would you?" asked Master Sergeant Rodriguez, a Marine Force recon veteran who had joined their team.
"How often do you check your compass against a known reference point? How often do you verify GPS coordinates using alternative methods?" Williams studied their map more carefully. "In Afghanistan, I had a mission where our GPS started giving us bad readings because of atmospheric interference.
We didn't realize it for hours because we assumed the equipment was working correctly."
"What did you do?" Hayes asked.
"We got lost for 8 hours and nearly walked into an enemy patrol because we were miles from where we thought we were." The exercise continued for 6 hours, with teams gradually developing improvised solutions to navigation challenges they had never specifically trained for. By the end of the day, all of the instructor candidates had experienced the psychological stress of operating without reliable equipment, and most had discovered capabilities they didn't know they possessed.
"How do you feel?" Sarah asked during the debrief session.
"Exhausted," said Hayes. "But also more confident about my ability to navigate under difficult conditions." "Frustrated, but in a good way," added Rodriguez.
"It forced us to think about navigation as a problem-solving exercise rather than just following predetermined procedures."
"More importantly," Williams said, "it made me realize how dependent I am on equipment that I never question. I've been assuming my tools work correctly for 20 years, and today showed me how dangerous that assumption can be."
Sarah nodded.
"That's the psychological shift we're trying to create. Not paranoia about equipment failure, but awareness that backup thinking is just as important as backup equipment." The discussion that followed lasted nearly 2 hours, with the instructor candidates analyzing what they had learned about themselves and their students. More importantly, they began to understand how this type of training could be implemented safely while still providing genuine psychological challenge. Over the following weeks, the instructor candidates went through increasingly complex scenarios designed to teach them not just specific training techniques, but the underlying philosophy of adaptive instruction. They learned to read stress responses in their students, to adjust scenario difficulty in real time, and to debrief exercises in ways that reinforced psychological resilience rather than just technical skills. Major Hayes, who had begun the program as a skeptic, gradually became one of its most effective advocates. During a particularly challenging exercise involving simulated chemical weapon exposure, she demonstrated an intuitive understanding of how to push students beyond their comfort zones without crossing into actual danger. "I think I'm beginning to understand what you're really teaching," she told Sarah during a private conversation after the exercise. "It's not just about surviving equipment failures or navigating without GPS. It's about maintaining cognitive function under extreme stress."
Exactly. The specific skills are secondary to the psychological adaptation.
If soldiers can think clearly when everything is going wrong, they can figure out solutions to problems they've never encountered before.
"But that raises an interesting question," Hayes continued. "How do we know when we've pushed someone too far?
How do we identify the line between productive stress and potentially harmful trauma?" Sarah had been waiting for someone to ask this question, because it addressed the most serious challenge of implementing her methods on a large scale.
That's why instructor selection is so critical. Not every good trainer can handle this type of instruction.
It requires people who can read subtle psychological cues and make split-second decisions about scenario modification.
What kind of background produces that ability?
Usually some combination of combat experience, psychological training, and personal exposure to high-stress situations. People who have learned to manage their own stress responses under extreme conditions. As the 4-week instructor training program neared its end, Sarah found herself reflecting on how much the program had evolved since her early days at Fort Richardson. What had begun as an informal approach to helping 12 soldiers think differently had become a sophisticated training system with detailed protocols, safety procedures, and measurable outcomes. The question that worried her was whether the systematization had preserved or destroyed the essential elements that made the training effective. The final exercise for the instructor candidates was designed to test their ability to create and manage adaptive training scenarios for actual special operations students. Each candidate was assigned a team of soldiers and asked to design a training exercise that would challenge their students' ability to think creatively under stress. Major Hayes chose to create a scenario involving a rescue mission where all standard communication equipment failed and the team had to coordinate their actions using improvised signals and predetermined fallback procedures they had to develop on the spot. Sergeant Major Williams designed an exercise where soldiers had to complete a reconnaissance mission while dealing with simulated injuries that limited their mobility and sensory capabilities. Master Sergeant Rodriguez created a survival scenario where teams had to find food, water, and shelter using only materials they could scavenge from what appeared to be a disaster area. Sarah observed each exercise, evaluating not just the technical execution but the psychological impact on both instructors and students. What she saw convinced her that the program had successfully scaled up while preserving its essential character. The instructor candidates had learned to create genuine uncertainty without compromising safety, to challenge their students' assumptions without destroying their confidence, and to debrief exercises in ways that built psychological resilience. More importantly, they had learned to think differently about the purpose of military training. Instead of simply preparing soldiers to execute specific procedures under controlled conditions, they were preparing soldiers to maintain cognitive function and creative problem-solving ability under any conditions they might encounter. On the final day of the instructor program, General Walsh visited the facility to observe a demonstration exercise and evaluate the results of the expanded training initiative. 6 months ago, she told the assembled instructors and students, "We had a promising training method being used with 12 soldiers at one base. Today, we have 37 qualified instructors working with over 200 special operations candidates using methods that have proven effective across multiple scenarios and environments." She paused, looking around at the faces in the room. "But, more importantly, we have soldiers who are prepared for the kind of combat they actually face, not just the kind of combat we wish they faced." General Walsh turned to Sarah. "Miss Martinez, when we first met, you told me that you couldn't mass-produce this kind of training. I'm curious about your assessment now that we've implemented it on a larger scale." Sarah stood up, aware that her answer would influence the future development of the program. "General, I think we've proven that the methods can be scaled up successfully, but only because we've been willing to accept that effective training looks different in different contexts." "Explain that." "Each of our instructors teaches these principles differently, based on their own experience and the needs of their specific students. We haven't tried to create a standardized curriculum that every instructor follows identically." "And you think that's sustainable as we expand to more bases and more instructors?" "I think it's the only approach that will work. The moment we try to turn this into a paint-by-numbers training program, we'll lose what makes it effective." General Walsh nodded thoughtfully. "That presents challenges for military implementation, but I think you're right. The results speak for themselves." As the ceremony concluded and the new instructors prepared to deploy to their assigned bases, Sarah felt a sense of cautious optimism about what they had accomplished. They had taken training methods developed under extreme circumstances and adapted them for use in military education without losing their essential effectiveness. The 12 soldiers at Fort Richardson had become nearly 300 soldiers across multiple bases, all learning to think differently about survival and adaptation in combat situations. But, more than that, Sarah had discovered that teaching others to survive had helped her finally process and integrate her own traumatic experiences. The skills that had once been tools of survival had become tools of instruction, transforming pain into purpose in ways she had never expected. Standing in the Colorado mountains, watching the sun set over the training facility that had grown from her unconventional ideas, Sarah realized that she had found something she had been searching for without knowing it, a way to ensure that other people would never have to learn the lessons she had learned the hard way. The soldiers walking away from the facility that evening carried with them not just new techniques and procedures, but a fundamentally different understanding of their own capabilities and limitations. They knew now that they could think clearly under pressure, solve problems they had never encountered before, and survive situations that would have overwhelmed them just months earlier. Most importantly, they knew that their minds were weapons that would never malfunction, tools that would never break, and resources that would never run out as long as they refused to give up thinking. In the years that followed, veterans of Sarah's training program would find themselves in combat situations across the globe, facing challenges that no traditional training could have prepared them for. But they would face those challenges with confidence, knowing that they had been taught not just to fight, but to think, to adapt, and to survive when survival seemed impossible. And they would remember a quiet woman who had refused to let her own survival be meaningless, who had transformed her trauma into wisdom and her pain into protection for others who followed the same dangerous path she had once walked alone.